Welcome back to the Al Monitor Brief. I'm Adam Lucente. Finally, we're doing a podcast on Iran. Now, this has been an evolving situation. We've had difficulty communicating with people there. Things on the ground and the outlook from the US are constantly changing. But now we're doing it, so let's jump in. For reference, we're recording this on Wednesday evening, January 14th, East Coast time in the US. So the Iranian protests and riots have been ongoing since late December, sparked by another collapse of the currency against the US dollar. Now, to be clear, the rial was falling well before that for some time, so much so that they even considered nixing zeros from it. The demonstrations and riots really picked up steam in the last few days. And now at this stage, we're waiting to see if they will continue amid the crackdown. Iran is on day 7 of an internet shutdown. The US-based human rights activist news agency, which covers Iran, says that the death toll is now above 2,570. US President Donald Trump has repeatedly said that if protesters are killed, he will act. But it's unclear when and what form that would take if it does happen. Al Monitor's Jared Zuba confirmed Wednesday that the US is evacuating some personnel from the El Udeid base in Qatar, and a number of countries are warning their citizens to leave Iran. But Trump said later on Wednesday that the killing is, quote, stopping, potentially indicating a strike is not imminent. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi went on Fox News Wednesday evening, and he dodged questions on the death toll, and he blamed the unrest on outside agitators seeking to provoke a war. Then there were also reports that an aircraft carrier, a U.S. aircraft carrier, was en route to the region from Asia, and that a NOTAM, which is a warning to pilots, was issued for Iranian airspace. So as you can see, there's a lot going on. One Iranian contact I spoke to recently said that the Islamic Republic has never been weaker. Another said that these protests feel, quote, different. Now, a number of Iran observers and political scientists say that the conditions are there for a revolution. But, the 1979 revolution that brought the Islamic Republic to power, that went on for more than a year before the Shah was finally forced out. And Iran has had many protests before. Now, in 2009, those major protests were led by reformists who were not necessarily seeking to overthrow the government. But 2022 into 2023 was a huge protest movement. It was crushed, and then life went on. But now Iran is weakened since the start of the Gaza war. There's a man in the White House willing to hit them, as he did last year. Russia and China did not show much interest in defending Iran, at least militarily, during the 12-day war last year. And again, the country is faced with big protests and riots. In this episode, we're going to hear from a number of our correspondents on what's next for Iran and the region as a whole. We'll go over how states like Israel and Turkey view the situation, what the U.S. is seeking to accomplish exactly, and more. Hope you enjoy. I first asked our Pentagon correspondent, Jared Zuba, what the U.S. would be seeking to accomplish with striking Iran amid these demonstrations, and also the limitations on what an attack might achieve. Here's what he said.
Well, Adam, I think that's a really good question, and it's one of the big remaining open unknowns of a lot of observers who are sort of waiting or anticipating that Trump will strike. The question is, how can the Trump administration strike Iran and Iran's government and its security forces, whether kinetically or non-kinetically through cyber attacks or information operations? How can it do so in ways that don't alienate the protest movement? And if it does so kinetically, are there ways to do it which don't sort of encourage sort of nationalist sympathies of the Iranian people and sort of weaken the protest movement and cause a rally around the flag effect? So these are certainly considerations that the White House has been weighing over in the past several days. But one has to wonder as well, if the United States military were to strike at, say, empty facilities of the Basij forces or IRGC or, domestic police, something like this, what would it really accomplish? If you're not going to conduct strikes that could destabilize the regime, what is the purpose of doing this? And how are the Iranian security forces going to react? Is it possible that they could react by taking out, by enacting further repression against the people of Iran, by sort of becoming more aggressive in their attempt to root out what they see as Israeli-linked and U.S.-linked espionage, suspected agitators, infiltrators? Is this going to make the regime more paranoid and more destructive domestically? And, factoring into that question, I'm sure the White House has been weighing, through U.S. intelligence reports, whether or not the regime is actually threatened by these protests. As we saw, Al Monitor's correspondent in Tehran yesterday reported that there are no outward signs that the regime is experiencing any high-level defections among the security forces. So the big question is, what does the Trump administration think it can accomplish? And I think you're seeing with some of the hesitation here from President Trump, he's now twice seemed to throw cold water on the idea of an imminent strike. I suspect that is one of the factors playing into the delay, if that's what we're seeing.
I also asked Jared about how the positioning of U.S. troops around the whole world may factor into the administration's plans.
The other factor that may be causing some second thoughts in the White House is that there is not a U.S. aircraft carrier in the Middle East for the first time. Since we've seen these waves of confrontations between the U.S. and Israel on one side and Iran on the other over the past 2 years. Now, that doesn't mean the Pentagon can't strike Iran or can't. It doesn't have the Pentagon does have a wide variety of options to present the president for both kinetic and non-kinetic strikes. I mentioned cyber attacks, but there are also 3 U.S. Navy destroyers in Middle Eastern waters. 2 of them are in the Gulf right now. They are believed, or at least capable of carrying, several land attack cruise missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles, which can reach deep into Iranian territory and strike with extreme precision. So that's the concern is not the ability to launch the strikes. The concern likely would be at the White House level, the Pentagon level, senior Pentagon level. Well, what happens if Iran retaliates, which Iranian officials are vowing to do, including against U.S. bases in neighboring Arab Gulf states? That's where a U.S. aircraft carrier plays the most important role in deterring and reminding the Iranian government not to overplay its hand in what everyone knows will, of course, be some form of retaliation. So without a U.S. aircraft carrier there, it's harder for U.S. strategists and policymakers to predict the outcome and the shape and the nature of the Iranian retaliation. If the Pentagon wants to sort of control and shape the contours of second and third order repercussions of a strike on Iran, a carrier being there is going to be a big part of that. Now, the chief of naval operations, that's the U.S. military's highest-ranking U.S. Navy admiral, suggested today that the USS Ford, which is the most recent aircraft carrier to transit the Middle East, has not been requested to return from the Caribbean, where it had been stationed and still is during the pressure campaign against Nicolas Maduro's regime in Venezuela. And Admiral Caudle, said today that he would actually push back if the Trump administration does request to bring the Ford back to the Middle East, as it's nearing the end of its 7-month at-sea deployment cycle. And Caudle cited, of course, maintenance and personnel concerns. So there is something to be said for the Venezuela pressure campaign by Washington, sort of limiting the options, not of striking Iran, but of containing the second and third order effects of any strike on Iran.
Now, there's a diplomatic track, too. Trump said earlier in the week that Iran wants to talk, but on Tuesday he said he canceled the meetings with them, and then he posted on Truth Social that, quote, help is on its way. Here's our State Department correspondent, Elizabeth Hagedorn, on the mixed messaging from the Trump administration and what that might all mean.
The problem is that President Trump drew a red line on social media repeatedly, and now he has to back up that threat. He said on Tuesday that U.S. help for the protesters is on the way, but it's hard to see how the options Trump is considering, including a military strike, could provide meaningful support to the protesters or address their calls for regime change. The U.S. must also weigh the likelihood that an Iranian reprisal could place U.S. forces in the region at risk. And so by issuing this steady stream of threats to intervene, Trump appears to have boxed himself into a corner. On Wednesday, he seemed to try to lower expectations of a major U.S. response by saying that, the killing has stopped in the Iranian streets and that the authorities we're not moving forward with executions. But it's worth remembering that there was also a lot of mixed messaging like this from Trump before Israel's 12-day war with Iran in June. This time around, he's proving to be equally unpredictable.
That's a very good point on the 12-day war. Okay, so how is the region looking at this? The Wall Street Journal reported Tuesday that Gulf states have been warning the U.S. against attacking Iran, with Saudi Arabia leading the way. Now, Saudi Arabia, of course, has been a rival of Iran for some time. I would say that Bahrain is even more of a rival, but Saudi has chosen to have dialogue with Iran in the last few years instead of a more confrontational stance. And Qatar and the UAE have had decent relations with Tehran for some time. And, the Gulf region generally fears instability, disruptions to oil flows, and anything that would create a less friendly investment environment as they pursue their economic diversification plans and move away from oil and gas. Israel's more straightforward in a sense. They don't like Iran and vice versa. But there are concerns there about any blowback from U.S. strikes. Here's our Israel Pulse chief, Rina Bassist, on how Israel is looking at this and preparing for the various scenarios.
According to Mossad estimates, 5,000 protesters were killed so far by Iranian security forces. And as such, Israel believes that President Donald Trump's red line has been crossed and that a strike could be imminent. Trump must choose now how to react. He could go for a military operation, he could go for a cyber attack, or he could opt for the diplomatic route, relaunching talks on a nuclear deal. Still, prevailing assessment in Israel says it is highly likely that Trump would indeed opt for a military strike, though the scope of it and its targets remain unknown. Israeli security officials estimated today that in light of recent developments, the question is no longer if Washington will take military action, but when. Now, the Israeli security establishment fears that if Iran is indeed attacked by the Americans, it will try to turn its fire not only against American targets, but also against Israel, probably with an extensive missile attack, as it already did twice. The Iranian response, estimates the Israeli security apparatus, will depend on the nature and the extent of the American action. A limited American action would not necessarily lead to a response against Israel, but a large-scale action could provoke Iranian retaliation against the Jewish state. With this in mind, Israel has been on high alert for the past week, and even more so in recent hours. Preparations for such a scenario are ongoing, both defensively and offensively.
Turkey is maybe the most interesting to me in these regional dynamics. Turkey and Iran have often been described as frenemies. They have some differences, most notably, I would say, on Syria, but they both want to have cordial ties at the same time. They're two of the biggest and most influential countries in the region. Turkey being influential with its Islamist credentials and economy, close ties to the new government in Syria and Qatar, and Iran with its proxies who are albeit weakened. Here's Ezgi Akin in Ankara on the Turkish view, specifically why President Erdogan's government has security concerns about the situation in Iran, and how they view the ability of the Islamic Republic to hang on and withstand the demonstrations.
Turkey's approach to the unrest in Iran rests on two tracks. First, Turkish officials have acknowledged the protesters' grievances. Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said earlier this week that the demonstrations were sending a strong message to the Iranian leadership. He noted that public expectations in Iran, particularly among young people, hadn't been met, and his remarks somewhat amounted to a rare acknowledgement from Ankara that Iran's hardline governance and economic mismanagement are fueling genuine domestic discontent. That being said, Ankara is watching developments in southeastern neighbor with deep caution. Despite Turkey's long-standing rivalry with Iran, as both Ankara and Tehran are vying for influence in the region, Turkish officials don't want to see prolonged instability in Iran. From Turkey's standpoint, such a scenario carries direct risks for Turkey. The most immediate concern one can think of is the potential refugee flows. Turkey already hosts millions of Syrians and anti-refugee sentiment is running high domestically. So instead, without explicitly naming the Trump administration, Turkish officials have been warning against any foreign intervention in Iran, saying such a move would risk triggering a broader turmoil in the already volatile region. At the same time, Ankara is also urging Tehran to reduce tensions in a bid to create an off-ramp to resume negotiations with the United States and other Western powers. Furthermore, Turkish assessments suggest that despite the scale of the demonstrations, the Iranian regime remains resilient with its security apparatus intact and opposition forces fragmented. And Ankara doesn't believe that a foreign intervention at this point could spell the end of the regime.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with more after this short break.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al-Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al-Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.
Okay, we're back. Let's shift the focus back to Iran itself at this point. There's been a lot of comparisons made in U.S. politics to Venezuela. The U.S., of course, recently went into the country, captured President Maduro, and now a government led by his vice president seems to be playing ball more with Washington. Now, as a Middle East reporter, I can't say I know Venezuela super well. But I can tell you that Iran's leadership structure is perhaps more multifaceted. It's not just about Ayatollah Khamenei, and it's certainly not solely about President Pezeshkian. Here's my colleague Rosaline Carroll with a rundown of the main leaders and institutions governing Iran.
Iran has a variety of leaders and institutions that all wield influence over politics, security, and the daily life of Iranians. So understanding these main players helps explain how the government responds to unrest and protests, and just general vulnerability. In Iran, there exists a sort of skeletal framework of democracy, I like to think, which is de facto and de jure superseded by religious authority, namely the supreme leader. On paper, there exist things like the parliament, which suggest elements of a republic, but when quote-unquote democracy brushes up against the will of the supreme leader, he will always take precedence. So first are the people and the institutions not elected by the Iranian people, or at least not directly. At the top is the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He controls Iran's general policies, the armed forces, the intelligence services, and key appointments across the judiciary, the media, and the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Khamenei also selects 6 members of the Guardian Council, giving him a lot of influence over elections and legislation. He is unelected by the people. He's elected instead by the Assembly of Experts, and he serves for life. Next is the Guardian Council. I mentioned that before. It's currently chaired by Ahmad Jannati and vets candidates for parliament, the presidency, and the Assembly of Experts. It also reviews all legislation for compatibility with Islam, effectively giving it veto power over laws and political contenders. Then there is the Expediency Council, which is appointed by Khamenei, and it's meant to resolve disputes between Parliament and the Guardian Council, and also serves as an advisory body to the Supreme Leader. Next is the Judiciary. It's a formally independent, but in practice controlled by Khamenei, who appoints its head, and the head in turn appoints its chief prosecutor. It includes civil and criminal courts, revolutionary courts, and special courts for clerics, which the clerical court's rulings are final and unappealable. So then there is the IRGC, commanded currently by Major General Mohammed Pakpour. It reports directly to Khamenei. The Quds Force is its external wing, which helps to coordinate its so-called axis of resistance. The IRGC also oversees the Basij, a paramilitary force whose name has been floating around a lot in recent days. It effectively enforces public order for the Iranian government and monitors and suppresses protests.
I told you it's complicated. Now Rosaline will go over the elected positions.
Then there are the elected bodies. The president, currently Masoud Pezeshkian, oversees economic policy, the cabinet, and domestic administration, and in theory, some national security, but decisions on security and foreign policy ultimately lie with the supreme leader. There's also the parliament, the Islamic Consultative Assembly, known also as the Majlis. The Majlis drafts legislation, approves a budget, and ratifies international treaties. But again, all laws are filtered through the Guardian Council, and many candidates for the parliament are disqualified before elections. Lastly, there's the Assembly of Experts, which is an 88-member body of clerics. It's tasked with selecting and, in theory, overseeing the supreme leader. In practice, though, I don't believe it has ever publicly challenged Khamenei. So, while Iran holds elections for the president, parliament, and Assembly of Experts, real power is concentrated in unelected bodies and security forces loyal to Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
I think one way that might be helpful to think about all that is that the president is kind of the face of the Islamic Republic to the world. Pezeshkian notably has been more open to dealing with the West than his predecessor, Ibrahim Raisi. And the president also has some ability to influence domestic policy, but major and final decisions rest with Khamenei. Speaking of the Iranian security apparatus, I want to leave you with something from our correspondent in Tehran. He wrote Tuesday, quote, "One of the clearest indicators of regime vulnerability, namely defections among the elite or military positions, has not materialized yet." So what do we make of that? This could be the beginning of the end of the Islamic Republic. It could not be. Time will tell. We will be covering this regardless. Thank you for listening to the Al Monitor Brief. Until next time, I'm Adam Lucente.